Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the hypothalamus in the Endocrine 3 video. This is the third video in the series, so make sure you've watched Endocrine 1 and Endocrine 2 before coming back here to talk about the hypothalamus. So we're talking about the hypothalamus because there are a series of hormones that are under the control of the hypothalamus. Some of them are made by the hypothalamus and released by another gland, and some of these hormones are made by the hypothalamus itself and then trigger some other gland to do something. Oftentimes, when we talk about homeostatic loops, we're talking about the control center. For all of the hormones in this video, the control center is the hypothalamus. What you're seeing here is a sagittal plane through one of the brain models in the lab. If you go back and remember your brain identification, you will notice that this is the little bird face, which is the diencephalon. The corpus callosum is the place where tracks cross from one side to the other in the brain. We have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. And this highlighted area right here is the hypothalamus, and it controls the autonomic nervous system. Remember that the autonomic nervous system is any motor response except for skeletal muscles. Those are part of the somatic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system controls glands, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. This is how our sympathetic nervous system can mount a fight or flight response in response to danger, or our parasympathetic nervous system can mount a resting and digesting response when things are cool. But the hypothalamus is in control of so many more things. Our body temperature, for example. We know that sweat glands are activated when we get too hot. How does that happen? The hypothalamus receives information from receptors in the skin, the muscle fibers, and the liver. It makes a decision and it sends out instructions to the sweat glands that activate them. So the hypothalamus is the control center in that system. The hypothalamus also helps to regulate whether we're hungry, whether we're thirsty, whether we are sleepy, and it also controls the endocrine functions of the pituitary gland. What we're going to be talking about today are these functions. You can see the little round ball that hangs down from the hypothalamus. It's got a blue star on it. That's the pituitary gland. And if you go back to the skeletal system identification, that pituitary gland sits inside the little crevice made by the sella turcica. So the pituitary gland is actually made out of two different lobes. We have the anterior lobe, which is on this side, and the posterior lobe on the back. So the anterior lobe responds to hormones that come from the hypothalamus. Remember, the hypothalamus is up here in the bird beak, and the little seed that hangs down is the pituitary gland. So hormones that are made in the hypothalamus will go through this blood supply and stimulate the cells of the anterior pituitary. Depending on which hormones are made by the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary will respond with one of 6 different hormones that it makes and secretes. The posterior lobe actually just stores the hormones that were made in the hypothalamus. So it's not making its own hormones, it's releasing hormones when told to by the hypothalamus. So there's only 2 hormones that are released from the posterior lobe. Let's start with the posterior lobe since it's a little bit easier. So those 2 hormones that are made by the hypothalamus and released by the posterior pituitary are antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, and oxytocin. So in ADH, what happens is the blood osmolarity gets too high. So what that means is there's too much stuff in the blood. It gets too thick. So the hypothalamus receives information about this, makes its decision, and it tells the posterior pituitary to release antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone is actually going to act on cells in the kidney. Specifically, cells that are in the collecting duct of the kidney. So the collecting duct is where we're taking the filtered plasma that we filtered out in the kidneys, and it's going down and it's going to eventually become urine, which will be held in the bladder until excretion. So what happens is when antidiuretic hormone is being produced, it causes ADH. I'm just going to make ADH be little stars. ADH is released into the bloodstream. ADH binds to receptors on the cells that are lining those kidney tubules, and it causes those kidney tubules to insert aquaporins. Aquaporins are little channels on the apical surface of these cells that will allow water to leave the collecting duct and go back into the bloodstream through that interstitial space between the collecting duct and the blood vessel. And the reason that this is important is when you haven't had something to drink for a long time, you start getting a little bit dehydrated, we want to save as much of that water as possible. We want to keep ourselves from getting dehydrated. This is how we concentrate the urine. So you might notice that at night, after being up all day and having dinner and drinking something at dinner, your urine is quite clear, but first thing in the morning, it's usually pretty concentrated. It's because we were able to take water out of the filtrate, out of the urine, and save it back into the blood. If there's no ADH, there's no aquaporins, and that excess water will be excreted in the urine. The second hormone released from the posterior pituitary is oxytocin. You would find this at the end of pregnancy. As the baby grows, it pushes down on the cervix, and that increased pressure activates stretch receptors in the cervix. That sends a signal to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus tells the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. Oxytocin circulates through the blood, acts on the smooth muscles in the uterus, and causes contractions. Those contractions actually increase the stimulus, and we know that increasing the original stimulus is a sign of positive feedback, and the whole loop keeps on happening. The more pushing, the more oxytocin, the more contraction of the uterine muscles, and this continues until eventually the baby is pushed out. Oxytocin is also important in stimulating milk letdown. So when the baby is nursing, even if there is plenty of milk in the mammary glands, it won't be released unless oxytocin opens the milk ducts. Oxytocin's third function is as the love hormone. You will find high levels of oxytocin anytime that you are with somebody that you enjoy being with. Those feelings of love and happiness are due to excess oxytocin in your bloodstream. So both men and women feel the effects of oxytocin. The anterior pituitary makes 6 hormones. The hypothalamus sends out instructions to the anterior pituitary, and depending on what instructions they are, it will make one of these 6 hormones: growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, prolactin, or my personal favorite, adrenal corticotropic hormone. Let's go through them one at a time. Growth hormone in children stimulates the growth of muscles and connective tissues, such as bones. So as children are growing bigger, growth hormone is helping that happen. If you don't get enough growth hormone, you end up with something called pituitary dwarfism. So you don't grow very large. If you have too much, you end up with something called gigantism. In adults, you still have growth hormone, but just not at as high levels as in children. And in adults, the role of growth hormone is to increase protein synthesis for repair of broken or damaged cells, connective tissue, or muscles. You can potentially get a tumor or something in the pituitary gland that can cause excess production of growth hormone. That causes a condition called acromegaly, where there's excessive growth of the joints and cartilage. You can see over here that the joints are quite enlarged. The brow ridges and nose and face tend to be very enlarged in these people as well. You're not going to be able to grow the bones because the growth plates have already closed, but cartilage can grow in response to growth hormone. Our second hormone is thyroid stimulating hormone. This acts on the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone increases your basal metabolic rate, so basically your metabolism. If you don't have enough thyroid hormone, it's called hypothyroidism, and you tend to be sort of sluggish and cold and tired. You tend to become overweight. This is actually very common in middle-aged women. There's an autoimmune disease where antibodies attack the thyroid gland and disrupt its ability to produce thyroid hormone, and so they tend to have all of these symptoms. Hyperthyroidism, however, is the opposite. You produce too much thyroid hormone. You tend to be very thin, again, because your metabolism is all jacked up, but you also are jittery, quick to startle, and sort of hyperactive. The next two I'm going to just do together because they both have the similar effects. They both act on the testes and the ovaries to stimulate production of sex hormones and mature gametes. Prolactin is produced in response to suckling during nursing. This hormone signals the mammary glands to produce milk. So remember, oxytocin was important in letting the milk down. Prolactin is important in producing milk. So prolactin is produced by the anterior pituitary. Oxytocin is released by the posterior pituitary. Both of these are stimulated by suckling, which tells the hypothalamus to produce these two hormones. These are both positive feedback control. The more suckling and nursing you do, the more milk you produce. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is produced by the anterior pituitary and acts on the adrenal gland. Now, we already talked about the adrenal gland before when we talked about random hormones. Remember, they sit on top of the kidneys like little hats. And the medulla is directly innervated by the nervous system, meaning there's a neuron that comes in and causes these cells to produce two hormones, norepinephrine and epinephrine. And these are important. They are released to upregulate the sympathetic nervous system. This hormone, ACTH, acts on the adrenal cortex. And instead of short-term stress response, like you would get with norepinephrine and epinephrine, this involves long-term stress response and the production of cortisol. So cortisol is going to downregulate your immune system. It's going to facilitate muscle tissue breakdown for energy. That muscle tissue will be broken down and released into the blood as glucose, and your blood pressure will be increased. Those things, pretty much none of them are any good for you. So this cortisol doesn't really help you out. If you were having a short-term stress, like having to run away from a bear, you would like to not be worried about fighting off infection or having a lot of blood glucose in your blood. You actually need it so that you can run away from the bear. However, when this is happening all the time, and it goes on and on and on for years at a time, all of these things are bad. Downregulating the immune response can leave you vulnerable to infection, and having a lot of blood glucose in your blood can leave you susceptible for diabetes and basically gaining weight, as well as high blood pressure or hypertension is not good for your vessels either. So the stress response here, long-term stress response and high cortisol levels are not great for you. That's it for today. We're going to talk a little bit more about another hormone that's produced by the adrenal cortex, aldosterone, in the next video, Endocrine IV. See you in class.